Good evening, and welcome to Regent College. As we begin, I want to acknowledge we're gathered on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'm Jeff Greenman. I'm the president of the college. I'll be your host and MC for the Laing Lectures this year. This is Laing Lectures 2024, which is now the 25th year, seeing as this series began in 1999. More on that in just a minute. But thank you very much for being here. A welcome to those of you that are joining us on the live stream as well. Wherever you may be, and whatever time zone you may be in, I'm glad you're joining with us. It's great to have you here. Regent College is a place where we explore the meaning of Christianity, the gospel of Jesus Christ crucified and risen, the significance of that gospel for all areas of life, for every area of society and culture, and for the issues that we all live with every day. And the Laing Lectures has been given to us as a tremendous gift to allow further interaction of the kind that Regent College wants to do all the time, but in a special way over 3 nights together. So it's always been a special joy to have every year the Laing Lectures happening since, as I say, 1999, to just allow us to go further and deeper into exploring the meaning of the Christian faith for every area of life. So that's definitely true for the topic that we will examine together in these next few days. So let me say a little bit about the Laing Lectures. You have a brochure that you've received. There's a bit of detail there, further detail about the background of the Laing Lectures. The Laing Lectures go back to '99 through the generosity of Roger and Carol Lang. Roger is with us. Give us a wave, Roger. There's Roger. Yep. Roger and his wife Carol have very generously supported this year by year to make possible a very special experience for us at the college. That series is named after his father, a pastor who loved big ideas and books and conversations. And in a sense, Roger fell very close to that paternal tree, loving books and conversations, and has gifted us with this. So the purpose of these lectures is to encourage persons recognized for scholarship, wisdom, and creativity to undertake original thinking about a matter of significance for the Christian church, to share their thinking with the Regent community and the general public through a series of lectures. And this brings us to what we're doing now. We were talking over dinner that the very first lecturer was Neil Postman, if that name rings a bell, Amusing Ourselves to Death, the name of his book about television, and Technopoly, his book about technology, which was the focus of the very first lectures back when. In more recent times, the novelist Marilynne Robinson has been with us, theologian Stanley Hauerwas, psychologist Ian McGilchrist, and many, many others. So we're really grateful to you, Roger, for your continued support and making this great experience available to us. So before I introduce our lecturer for this year, just a few logistical matters. A technical note as we begin. Be aware that the Laing Lectures are being filmed and photographed and live streamed, and shortly we will make the recording available through the YouTube channel of Regent College. And so by entering this location, you agree that Regent College has the right to use your likeness and image, etc., in marketing and advertising materials. And the details about all of that are on the door as you have entered tonight. After the lecture, you're invited to join Dr. Yancey at the bookstore. There's a book table just outside there at the bookstore with his own books, plus another table of books that are from other authors on related topics to the lectureship. I think you might enjoy those. A friendly reminder to turn off cell phones, pagers, beepers, things that are going to buzz or beep or interrupt the time tonight. Please turn those off. There's not audio or video recording allowed for this, and no flash photography, please. So, enough of all the logistical, technical stuff. Now for the good thing. I get to introduce Dr. George Yancey, who has come to us from Texas, flown in today. He is Professor of Sociology at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, professor and also professor at the Institute for the Studies of Religion there. He is married with 3 sons, ages 8, 7, and 5. He told me he came to Regent mostly to get some rest. And is now the coach of his 5-year-old's soccer team. Some of you have coached 5-year-olds in soccer? Yeah, it's amazing. Dr. Yancey's teaching and very prolific writing spans a whole variety of topics. The subject of this lectureship in terms of race and racism and racial reconciliation certainly been very central to his work for a very long time. But more generally, the role of religion in society. He has a previous book on atheism in America, very interesting. Marriage and family, another topic that he has taken up. Interracial dating and marriage. I don't know if he gives personal advice on that front, but he studied that very carefully as a social scientist. Multiracial churches is something else he has studied and written about, as well as academic bias and anti-Christian bias. So there's quite a lot of interesting things he's been working on. Political division in the U.S., which is a topic known to many of us. And just wanted to point out, this is what is known in the U.S. political system as Super Tuesday. I told him it's Super Tuesday for us because he's here with us. That makes it Super Tuesday for us. But you might be interested in his book called One Faith No Longer, The Transformation of Christianity in Red and Blue America. It's on conservative and progressive, in a sense, movements politically and how they work out theologically in the U.S. And he's working on another book about American Christianity as well, Red Christianity, Blue Christianity to be the title. Some of you may be familiar with a more general audience title he wrote recently called Beyond Racial Division. So, he has a great deal to offer from this very prolific work as a scholar, and in hopes of informing us and in stretching us, challenging us regarding one of the most central realities of modern society, racial division in his native United States, for us in Canada and for so many societies worldwide. The phenomenon of that division and racism and the church's understanding in response to it is what we hope to learn about through Dr. Yancey's lectures on this theme of Christian racial reconciliation. So just a quick word about our format then for tonight. We'll follow the traditional format that we've used many, many times at Regent College for evening public lectures. So in a moment, Dr. Yancey will address us for around an hour or so, and then we'll take questions from you. So be thinking about questions you may want to ask. For that purpose, there's microphones at the top of the aisles. When the time comes, just come on up there and ask your succinct and focused question, and we'll be glad to have a wonderful answer from Dr. Yancey. For those of you who are joining us in the live stream, you can also send in a question to questions@regent-college.edu, and we'll bring some of your questions from online into the conversation as well. So, with all of those preliminaries, and with deep gratitude, welcome Dr. George Yancey.
I fist bumped him because I got a sick wife and a sick kid at home, and so I'm trying not to spread the love to other Canadians, and so I slip up every time to shake a hand, but I'm going to try a fist bump, okay? So I'm normally not that, but we'll try the fist bump. I'm doing a little experiment now. I'm trying to see how much energy I have when I haven't had to put to bed my 3 boys. So for me it's 9 o'clock back, and right now I'm starting to think that time to wind down for bed because I'm exhausted. So I got a little bit of energy now. So let's hope that I can hold out. I really want to thank you all for your warm welcome and bringing me here, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Here's the question that really is at the center of how I look at racial issues, because I am an academic and I'm a Christian. So my question is, what does my faith have to say for how we solve racial problems? All right? What does my faith have to say? Does it have something unique to say? Because there are times in which our faith has nothing unique to say. 2 + 2 = 4. Our faith has nothing unique to say about that, all right? That's just a fact. how we live in community with others, and how we love our neighbors, our faith has a great deal to say. I think race falls into that second category. So, I have the benefit, because this is a talk that I've given to a lot of churches where I have 30 minutes to do the sermon, and of course, the last 5 minutes is to do the call and the response and the altar call and everything like that. So I only have 25 minutes to really do it. And now I have 3 nights. So I can unpack it. So if you're thinking, what's the answer going to be? It's not going to be told tonight. Tonight, I want to address something first. Before we get to that, get to what our faith has to say, I think we have to understand the problem. Because if we don't understand the problem, then we're going to have bad answers. And to understand the problem, I want to look at institutional racism, past and present. The reason is we can't understand where we're at today unless we understand what's happened and how it manifests itself today. So we're going to look, this is probably going to be the lecture that's the most, how should I say it, professory? Is that a word? Professory? And it's also going to be the lecture that's most American-centric. Well, I should say he's US-centric, because you're Americans too. You're the Northern Americans, we're the Southern Americans. But what I mean by this, I'm going to focus a lot on what's happening in the United States, understanding that in Canada there's a different context. In the United States, a lot, not all, a lot of the racial discussion is on the white-black divide. Now, yes, we also have Asians and Hispanics and Native Americans, but a lot of it really originates from this white-black, and then there's a history behind that. It's less the case in Canada. I know that. There's indigenous people, a lot of the immigration, especially from Asia, brings in different dynamics. We have those dynamics too, but not to the degree you have in Canada. So I understand that. I do think some of the principles I'm going to discuss tonight do apply to Canada. How much it does, you all are in a position to contextualize it. But I think some of the conclusions I'm going to draw will definitely apply. And then tomorrow night, we'll look at what we've tried to do as a country and what I've seen done in other Western countries, including Canada, and it's not worked. And then Thursday, if you're still with me, if I've not driven you off, I'll go into what I think is a better way, what I think is a Christian approach towards it. And then, we could have that sort of discussion. All right, so that's the setup. Let's see what we can get. Okay, we live in what I call a racialized society. And that's a society wherein race matters profoundly in differences for life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. Now, what I am saying is race matters. How people react to me, my race matters. My experiences, my race matters. And your race matters too. When I teach this class, sometimes I have white students come up and say, well, man, I wish that, my race could really matter because, you're black, it's cool, all these things happen. I say, your race matters too. Hey, go play basketball out there. You're going to be the white guy, right? Your race matters too. Your race matters in a negative way, playing basketball out there. Your race matters in a positive way, and I'll touch on that later on. Your race matters. Your race impacts the relationships you have. Your race will impact your opportunities you get, positive and negative. Let's accept some nuance, okay? There's rarely anything that's 100%. So if I was just sitting up here and say 100% of the time my race matters negatively, that's not true. Like I said, the basketball court. 100% of the time your race matters positive as a white person, that's not true either. We can look at, though, what tends to happen. And we're going to look at what tends to happen. All right, so thinking of exceptions does not violate the general rule. Race matters. We live in a racialized society. Now, to understand this, we have to look at ways that race matters. So how does racism impact us today? And I want to look at 3 different ways it impacts us today. First, we'll look at historical effects of racism. In other words, what happened historically still impacts us today. And this is very important to recognize because oftentimes what you'll hear is people say, well, that was horrible in the past, but today we got it all figured out. All right, so let's look at that. Let's unpack that. Current institutional racism. And what I mean by institutional racism is that it's not a personal racism. It's institutions that are set up that have a negative impact on certain racial groups, whether or not the individuals in them are personally racist. This is important for us to recognize because it becomes very easy to say, look, I'm not racist, therefore I'm not guilty of this. Now, there's a partial truth in that, right? The person themselves is not doing it. But if there is an institution that's impacting people, then it's their responsibility to deal with that institution. And then modern racist attitudes. So I want to be clear. The way these attitudes manifest themselves today is not the way it has been in the past. In part because there is stigma to being labeled a racist today. There's an interesting study that was done that had about 100 different things a person could be and ranked by which ones induced the most stigma. And number 10 was being a racist. And then, this is true, the other 9 above number 10 were all illegal. Things such as beating your wife or sexual abusing your kid or drunk driving. So one conclusion I draw from this is the worst thing you can do stigma, as far as stigma, that's legal, is being a racist. So, if I know that you're sexually abusing your kid, I'm calling the police. If I have evidence, I'm obligated to call the police. If I know you're a racist, I'm not calling the police, right? What are the police going to do? Okay, well, he's a jerk. Go on with your life. There's nothing the police can do that's not against the law, but it's heavily stigmatizing. Modern racist attitudes doesn't work the same way it used to. And so we'll take a look at this. And so this is my goal for this evening. This is all we're going to do this evening is we're going to look at these ways to impact this, to set us up for tomorrow. All right, so I want to look at the first one, historical effects of racism. What I want to do is look at one segment of society to look at this. Because obviously, if I looked at all these different segments, we'd be here far past an hour. All right, so one segment of society, because if we look at one segment, it'll give us insight into other segments and how historical racism has impacted us. So what I'm going to do is look at this one segment, and what I want to look at is housing. It's kind of interesting that when I was flown to Canada, there's been a lot of talk about housing situation here. So housing is not some sort of minor detail. It's a very important detail. Now, it's not the only thing that's around. There's other factors we can look at. I'm just going to concentrate on that, and yes, I'm going to concentrate on the United States. And I don't know that much about the housing history in Canada. You can apply that as you see fit, but I think my point is how historically what's happening in housing impacts today. So, we know that there's a history of racial segregation when it comes to housing. And let's look at this history. Let's unpack this history and how it's played itself out. So early in our history, we had overt residential segregation. There were, at first, of course, under situations such as slavery and reservations, military literally putting people of color in residential neighborhoods and not allowing them to live away or live in integrated neighborhoods. And then after the Civil War and things of this nature, you still had things such as Jim Crow. Jim Crow is a situation in the United States where African Americans had to live in certain neighborhoods. It's what they call separate but equal. You may or may not be as aware of African American of U.S. history. It was called Jim Crow. It impacted other elements as well. So you had Jim Crow, where there were rules on where people of color could live, especially African Americans. They had to live in the black section of town. This was not a preference. This was the law. This was the rule of law. Overt residential segregation. So this period of time really lasted till the middle of the 1900s. It did not end with the Civil War. It really lasted where you had laws on where people of color could live up until the middle of the 1900s. Okay, as the laws go away, what we know is you had covert residential segregation. Now, covert residential segregation was ways segregation occurred that were not legalized but reinforced the segregation. The fact that people of color had to live away from European Americans. For example, in the United States, there's a practice known as steering. Steering was when the real estate agents would steer a person towards a neighborhood that was of their own race. And we know this happened. There's what we did called audit studies. And the audit studies when you send an African American or a Hispanic American and a white person to the same real estate agent and see what they do. And if I remember correctly, according to the research, about half the time they engaged in some sort of racialized practice that steered them away from, in other words, they didn't say, hey, where do you want to live? They said, oh, here's a neighborhood for you to live in. Now, that is not the law. So this is not the stage of overt. This is not laws, but this is covert residential segregation. It would happen in other ways. Those audit studies also showed that when people of color applied for housing, tried to buy a house or apply to rent in a neighborhood that was not of their own race, they had to face discrimination from the potential renters, potential landlords, potential sellers of the homes. Some homes actually had covenants saying you couldn't sell the house to certain people of certain races. This is covert. It's not the law, but it's still putting people into segregated areas. Okay, so we had that period of time. Now, the laws have changed to where steering is now illegal. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's illegal. So what do we have today? What we have today is residential segregation by choice. So we don't have the laws. We at least have reduced covert residential segregation, but what's happened is we created a momentum. We create a momentum. So now people choose to segregate by choice. Now, what some people will say is, well, if that's what people choose, that's what they choose. What can you do? We need to understand that this choice is not the same for whites and non-whites. We know a couple of things right now. We know that European Americans are more likely to choose to not live among people of color than the other way around. Is there an interracial preference for people of color? Yes. But it's not as strong as it is among European Americans. We also know that this preference is so incredibly strong, we can't document how powerful it is. Mathematical models attempting to show how far away whites will move to not have to live among African Americans can't determine how far that is. And it's based on people's actions. So this segregation by choice it is across racial lines, but it has different consequences for people of color, and the desire to live among one's own race is stronger among European Americans than it is among non-whites. Okay, so we have this momentum. And so in the United States, you have the black area of town, the Hispanic area of town, the white area of town. And it's not by a law, it's not Jim Crow, but it perpetuates itself. I actually did not go to the black high school in my town. I went to high school in a town called Amarillo, Texas. You may or may not have heard of it. Amarillo had a black high school. I didn't go. I went to a Hispanic high school. And I'll touch on that later. But the fact that I talk about going to Hispanic high school, and everyone knows what that means, that that's so common in the United States, that's almost expected. That's the way our segregation has worked in this country. All right, so why is all this important? All right, so people live where they live. Okay, so what's the big deal? Well, there are certain costs to segregation that we need to acknowledge and recognize. This is not free. There are costs to people of color because of this segregation, and I just want to touch on some of these costs. First cost is segregation will lower the property value of racial minorities' homes. So think about it this way. You got Group A, who happens to make more money per capita, and Group B. Group A does not want to live with Group B. They have more money per capita. What happens to the homes of Group B? There's less demand for their homes. And the people with more money don't want their homes. Their homes are going to have lower value. Often people buy homes. We're told, buy a home, it increases in value. You make money by that. And I'm not a financial advisor, so I guess, I've bought a home, so I guess I'm following along with that. But if you're a person of color, you buy a home in a community of color, that way to make money is less because it's going to go up less in value. If you need to borrow based on your home, get a mortgage loan, your home's going to be worth less. So what we do know is that the wealth of people of color is less than the wealth of whites, and this is one of the reasons why. That the home values do not go up nearly as much. It also enables certain types of discrimination to take place, such as redlining and school quality, and I'll go into this. So redlining is when a group draws a red line around a certain area to treat it differently than other areas. What this has most notably been noted in is banking and mortgages. A black or Hispanic area of town is redlined, and they are charged higher interest rates. They're less likely to get loans that they may want. You can also see it and sometimes you see it in Greek fraternity sororities, things of that nature. But I really am more concerned about the sort of financial outcomes for African Americans and Hispanic Americans because of redlining. Note that this type of discrimination is only possible because of segregation. In a world that you don't have racial segregation, you may still redline, and that still is a problem, but it's a problem felt by all racial groups. When you can redline and you can target certain groups, then it becomes a racial problem. School quality is another interesting problem. So you have the you have the neighborhoods that are of a certain racial group. In the United States, we use neighborhoods to determine what school you go to, usually. Not always, but usually. So what happens is that black area town, Hispanic area town becomes black school, white school, Hispanic school. And now the schools can be treated differently. So that Hispanic school I went to, you know what's interesting about that Hispanic school? The school I went to sucked at everything, except for one thing. And I'm very serious about this. Our football team really was horrible. You know, our basketball team, yeah, we had like 5'5" guys, you know, we were bad. But we were good at one thing. This is a Hispanic school. You know what we're good at? Industrial arts. We could build homes. We won state every year, and it wasn't even close. Like, we get 150 points, the next school would get like 50 points. We were bad at industrial arts. I mean, I'm sorry, white people, we were bad. Bad means good. Okay. Now, think about this. The other schools, the two white schools in my city, they were good at preparing their kids for college. Spanish schools preparing the Hispanics to build homes. Nothing wrong with that. Honorable living. But the people who run our country are going to college. School quality is connected to residential segregation. That only happens because the Hispanics live in certain parts of the city and they go to the same high school. If we did not have segregation, then the industrial arts school would also be training a lot of white students. And the schools that are sending kids to college will have a lot of Hispanics sending their kids to college. An interesting argument has been made from a book called American Apartheid. And Massey and Denton wrote the book, and they argue that what happens with segregation is you concentrate many dysfunctional elements into minority communities. So what happens is if you concentrate poor people into community, the problems connected to poverty is concentrated. Drug abuse, lower education performance, crimes is concentrated. So that even middle class African Americans, Hispanic Americans suffer in their community from these concentrated problems. They call this the Lynch Pin of poverty that is suffered by especially African Americans, but also Hispanic Americans. There does seem to be something to this, that there's a problem when you concentrate all these negative elements. Now, we know that there are very poor white communities out there, incredibly poor, just as bad off as some of the very poor communities of color. The difference, they argue, is that if those whites somehow reach middle class, they can move out of those poor white communities into a community that does not have all these negative elements concentrated. For African Americans and Hispanic Americans, in a situation of residential segregation, they can't move out. So they're still dealing with poor school quality, they're still dealing with crime, and they're still dealing with these things that they would normally be able to move away from. We have a larger conversation on what we should do with poverty for everyone. Totally agree with that. But this is something that has a unique problem that is impacting people of color. Another cost of segregation is that it separates lower class from the resources they need to improve their lives. So when I went to high school in Amarillo, even though I went to a Hispanic high school, I did live in the black section of town. There's a long story, that's not important. What's interesting is that in this black section of town, there are two grocery stores. I remember one of them being a Safeway, I forget what the other one was, and that was it. Whereas when I drove into the other sections of town, there's a lot of grocery stores. In the black section of town, there's relatively few businesses. So if I wanted a job, I had to catch the bus to the white section of town. The resources are separated, and I see this in town after town after town. We studied a town that literally had a river run through it. One half was African Americans, and the other half was European Americans. One grocery store in the African American section of town. Abundant grocery stores and other industries in the white section of town. What happens is that in these poorer communities, there's not these resources. This is possible, once again, because of segregation. So what you're seeing is that there are problems that are happening to communities of color that are possible because this history of segregation has set us up to be segregated. And then does not allow racial minorities to develop the interpersonal connections they need to succeed. When I was growing up, I did not have people around me who had been to college. I did have, my neighbor across the street was a high school teacher, so she had been, but most of my other people had not been to college. So when I went to college, and me being a first-generation college student, I didn't have anyone to tell me what college was going to be like. Now, does this mean that I had to fail? Of course not. But I didn't have role models for that. In fact, the person who influenced me to go to graduate school did not come from my neighborhood. And actually, I started attending a predominantly white church, and I met a man who gave me a job substitute teaching. And that job substitute teaching was very important to me because it changed my theology. You know, before substitute teaching, I believed there was a heaven and a hell. After substitute teaching, I believed there was a heaven, a hell, and substitute teaching. It was that bad. But in all seriousness, I remember talking to him one day, and this was after I had gotten my bachelor's degree, saying, you know, I don't know what I'm going to do. You know, I know I can't teach the rest of my life. And he says, well, why don't you go to grad school? And I said, I can go to grad school. I'm not smart enough. You know, that's for smart people. And he said, I've seen your grades. You can do it. And you know what? Let's say you go to grad school and you don't make it. At least you'll get some education and you'll be further along your path. So that influence, which I couldn't get from my neighborhood because no one had been to grad school before, I got from a white guy from the church. Now, I'm grateful to him, all right? But I couldn't get it from my neighborhood because of the segregation that's there, because I don't have the connections. The connections is not just role models, but how many jobs have we gotten because we know someone who knows someone? So, what's happened historically is impacting us today. Now, this is just housing segregation. I'm not talking about, criminal justice system, or healthcare, or economy, or military, and other institutions that historically have impacted the lives of people of color. This is just on housing segregation. We look at all that, we have to recognize that where we are today is in part due to what's happened historically. And those historical effects have not gone away. We've had civil rights legislation, Voting Rights Act, all that's a blessing. Being an overt racist is stigmatized. That's a blessing. We still have the impacts of what happened. You know, when you come across people who are engaging with one another, you have to know that you're only looking at a snapshot. You don't know what happened before. So you're coming across a couple, and she is berating him, and you're going, man, dude, I feel sorry for you. But what you don't know is he was cheating on her. Or you come across a guy who's incredibly mad at the woman, and you go, you don't deserve that. Or you may not know she just stole money from him. We can't look at where we're at today and say we understand everything. Okay? We have to look at what happened historically in order to know why we're at the situation we are today. Okay, so that's the first part, the historical cost of racism. Now I want to talk about the institutional racism. So let's touch on types of discrimination that we have. Now, we all know about personal discrimination. You know, someone doesn't like someone because of a different race. I want to talk about something a little bit different. That's institutional discrimination. And that is how discrimination is a part of the structures of our society. All right. Key thing about this is it does not require someone to be individually racist or hateful. You don't have to show this person is a racist for this to take place. There are two ways this can happen. One is direct, organized actions which is designed to discriminate negatively on race. Something like Jim Crow was direct. A person who is enforcing Jim Crow, may be a racist or not, it doesn't really matter. It's going to impact someone negatively on race, all right? A lot of direct institutional discrimination in the United States has been outlawed. So what we deal with more often is indirect institutional discrimination. Actions with a negative impact, but one that was not intended. Now, maybe it was intended, maybe it wasn't intended, we can't tell, and that's a key. You see, with indirect institutional discrimination, it's the focus on what people intend to do is less important. The focus is on what happens, right? I'm not a lawyer, I don't even play one on TV, but you have to try to prove intent. That's a high bar. So the focus is on what is actually happening. And then we can look at that. Okay, with that in mind, let's look at current institutional racism. Let's look at this. You know, do we have some situations like this? So let's look at some studies. This first study is on death penalties. In the United States, we have death penalty disparities. Now, the disparities is not by the criminal. It's by victim. And so what we know in the United States is that if you're going to kill someone, kill a black person. Because you kill a white person, you're more likely to get the death penalty. Now, I'm not saying criminals go around and say, oh, okay, all right. I'm not saying criminals do that. What I'm saying is that is the effect that we have, the way we administer the death penalty. Now, why is this? And what Umner and Zajac, I think that's how you say it, what they find is the reason why this is the case is not necessarily that people are racist per se, but the death penalty cases where you kill a white person and you put to death happens because in those districts, people are more likely to put you to death for killing people. In other words, in areas where you have mostly whites, you're more likely to get the death penalty for killing people. So is there an intent here? Is there a lower value of life for those who are the district attorneys in black neighborhoods? We don't know. But the effect is that the way we administer the death penalty treats life of color as less value than white life. Now, some people may say, well, all right, well, if you kill someone, you should get the death penalty no matter what. You know what? I'm not for the death penalty personally. That would at least be equal. But that's not reality. I mean, you can say, well, the problem is we're not administering the death penalty enough. I know probably Canadians don't say that, but believe me, there are plenty of Americans who do. But that's not reality. So rather than just saying that, why don't we look at what the reality is and see some of the institutional problems that may be connected to this. Okay, another interesting study. Fiblins et al. Found that immigration policies restrict the ability of all Hispanics to access beneficial social institutions such as education and healthcare. So we have immigration policies. Now people may say, hey, the people did this, they intended to be racist. Now as a lawyer, you have to prove that, right? No, regardless of their intentions, the immigration policy we have, which we know places a burden on Hispanics because they're the ones that we think of as, oh, they're illegal, right? So what happens is that Hispanics, not just undocumented Hispanics, all right? This is not just, people may say, well, if it's the undocumented, good, they're fearful. No, it's not just undocumented Hispanics. All Hispanics are generally less able to access beneficial social institutions because suspicion is put on them. So it goes to education, healthcare. they have less access to that. So it's not about arguing whether people are racist or not. It's about arguing this has a negative impact on this group, regardless of the intentions of others. Indirect is true discrimination. Okay, I've already touched on this a little bit on how racial segregation still impacts educational outcomes for people of color. That because of our segregation, regardless of what the policies that lead to it or impact it, it leads to those negative impacts. I want to touch, though, on this. So I want to talk about wealth. Oliver and Shapiro wrote a book called, I think it's either White Wealth, Black Wealth, or Black Wealth, White Wealth. I guess it's really not important. And what they argue is that when you look at the data and you look at whites and blacks, the same income level, right? Same income level. First off, whites tend to make more incomes than blacks, so there's an advantage there, but let's just equalize that, same income level. Whites have much greater wealth. Now, why do whites have much greater wealth? There's a variety of reasons for that. Part of it is that they come from wealthier families. So that, a European American and an African American, they get a job, they get a job as a school teacher, and they make $50,000, $60,000 a year, and they each make that. Well, the white comes from a wealthier family, which means they're going to get more wealth from inheritance. There can be educational systems that teach different lessons as to how to deal with wealth. So, once again, it's not intended to be discrimination, but the result is that whites have avenues to gain wealth. Interpersonal connections may help them to gain wealth. There are ways in which our society seems to work that allows whites to gain more wealth at the same income level. So if you think about income as just the check you get, how much money do you make this year? That's your income. Wealth is all that you own, your home, your retirement, all of that. So think about someone making $8,000 a year, $8,000 a year, and yet has, a $300,000 home and a $500,000 retirement versus someone who makes $8,000 a year and does not have a home and has very little in their retirement. Think about the difference of their lives. That is what we're looking at. So we have mechanisms in our society that may not intend, and sometimes don't intend, to provide advantages. But the advantages are there nonetheless. So, institutional racism is ways in which racism plays itself out that don't necessarily intend to discriminate, but discriminate nonetheless. I'll just throw one more in there. I don't think I put it down, did I? No, okay. The way in which we craft laws can have this effect. And the most famous case is the powder cocaine versus crack cocaine. That same amount of crack cocaine will get you about, 10 times the sentence of powder cocaine? Same amount. And what we do know is that European Americans tend to use powder cocaine, African Americans tend to use crack cocaine. So simply by following that law, you disproportionately punish African Americans, right? So, and once again, people could say, well, maybe we should make the law hard for everyone. Maybe we should. But until we do that, then this law is going to have a negative effect on African Americans. Okay. Well, all this is about, what's happened historically in our institutions. Well, what about our own attitudes? Do we have problems with our own attitudes on racial issues? So let's look at modern racist attitudes. In a society where, as I've just said, to be a racist is to be stigmatized. Okay, so we know that's true. To be a racist is to be stigmatized. So let's look at what some studies have shown, though. So this is an interesting study. So over the past 25 years, there's been no decrease in racial discrimination in hiring. So what do they mean by this? This, too, was an audit studies. In fact, this is what we call a meta-analysis, which is a lot of audit studies. So what they do is they look at all these different studies, and then they use the magic of statistics to combine them all together. You know, y'all think that Dr. Strange is magical. Wait till, you know, we get some numbers and then we do our own sort of magic, you know. Well, how's that, the rings? Yeah, okay. All right, so they combine all together. And so here's what the interesting part. So over the past 25 years, there's been a finding. And in these audit studies, they will send a white person and then a black or Hispanic person to a job. And there are techniques in which you sort of keep the resumes roughly equal. They can't be exactly identical or people get suspicious. And what they find is that the whites are invited for the interview more than the blacks and Hispanics. But here's the really, part to really catch your attention, no real decrease. So what this means is, what we're not seeing is, like, 25 years ago, the white person was 20% more likely to be called back, and now they're still a lot more likely to be called back, but it's only 10%, which means there's a decrease in discrimination. There's no real decrease over the past 25 years. In other words, over 25 years, whatever subtle racist attitudes that have led to this is still there. So overt racism can be stigmatized, but maybe you just don't call back the black or the Hispanic person for the job. And by the way, usually when they do this, it's not that you put a picture, because usually you may be thinking, well, when I apply for a job, I don't have a picture of myself there. They use names. So, Leroy or Juan, something like that. So just your name can signal your race and signal how you're treated. This is an interesting study, and this is done in 2020, all right? So we're talking about things that are more modern. The teachers are more likely to evaluate an identical white child's writing as better than a black child. So what they would do is, in this study, they would take the same writing sample, give it to half the teacher says from a white kid, half the teacher says from a black kid, and the evaluations was a little bit higher, was higher for the white kid than the black kid. Now, one can say, well, maybe you just got the wrong mixture, but if you get a high enough number of people doing the evaluation, person is not about the sort of, so sometimes you get a little statistical noise. Eventually, you get a statistical difference. When teachers know the writing style is from an African American, they evaluate it lower. Can this be because of an expectation that because of the stereotypes of African Americans not being as smart, that this is the case? Yes, it could be that. Regardless, if you're an African American, people are going to evaluate you lower than whites in this situation, and this likely has ramifications for how African Americans are seen in other situations as well. That the expectation is that they are not as qualified until the person proves otherwise. It's really not unlike the white guy walking on the basketball court. Let's be honest. White guy walks on the basketball court, we go, I want to pick the black guy. Until the white guy shows that, he's Dirk Nowitzki. And there's, okay, Dirk, you can play with us. Are there good Canadian white basketball players? I don't know if there are or not. I'm trying to think. Oh, wait, Steve Nash. Wasn't he Canadian? Okay, all right, Steve Nash, see? See, my Dallas roots paid off. So the guy proves Steve Nash, then he could play with us. It's probably that there's probably a similarity there. Only now we're not talking about basketball, we're talking about academics. Driving while black. So driving while black is that African Americans are pulled over more than European Americans by police officers. This study was done in Ohio. There's been another study, I think there's another study done in North Carolina, and I think there's one done in California. I just chose this one. And it shows that this is a very real thing. Police officers pull over African Americans more than they pull over European Americans. All right? So one thing people ask is, well, maybe blacks drive faster and more wild than whites. And so what they did was they would film the drivers, the white and black drivers. And the bad news is that blacks are just as bad drivers as whites. They're bad, and so are whites. So it's not driving style. But there was one time where they did not see this happening. The one time they did not see blacks being pulled over more than whites was at night. Because at night you can't see inside the car. So what's happening here? It's probably not an overt, as a black guy, let's go, hey, partner, let's go get the black guy. But there's a certain expectation, right? So modern racist attitudes comes and has these sort of implications. And then this study was interesting. This study, they looked at 37 different studies, and in 26 of the studies, they found evidence of racism in the beliefs and practices of medical health care providers. So it may be something such as their expectation of others based upon race. It may be what they prescribed others based upon race. But they found this, more than half of the studies found evidence of racism by healthcare providers. COVID wasn't that long ago. I know it's still around today, but it wasn't, it's not 2020. Thank you. 2020, that was a torturous year, yes, in many ways. So one of the things that happened in COVID was that African Americans and Hispanic Americans were less likely to get the vaccinated than European Americans. Now, as an African American, I would, I'd be happy to tell other African Americans, yes, you should get the vaccine when you can, when it's appropriate and everything like that. But I understood why. Because if you are encountering racism in the healthcare system, you're going to trust the healthcare system less. And you may not know exactly what you're encountering, but you go, well, these people don't like me. And for African Americans, there's a special case why they don't trust the healthcare system. For those who don't know, there was a case known as the Tuskegee experiments, where Tuskegee airmen had contact syphilis, and they said they were treating them, but they actually didn't because they wanted to see how the disease progressed. Blacks know about this, all right? So what's in this vaccine? Now, I'm not saying this is rational, okay? I'm not saying this is rational. I'm definitely not saying this is a smart way to think about things. So I just want to be honest about that. But African Americans say, well, I know about Tuskegee. What do they put in that vaccine? Maybe it's just water, and they just want to see what happens. When you have that, you have less trust, and there's a vicious circle where people make decisions that are not smart, but it's based on some actual facts that feed into this unwise decision. So this is some of the effects of some of the modern racist attitudes that we have, and you can see it's not. I didn't put something out there that some percentage of whites believe that blacks are intellectually inferior. What I'm saying is that it comes through in other ways other than overt statements. We don't even ask questions on overt racism anymore because the percentage of the sample that gives an answer that agrees with overt racism is so small, it's not worth our time. But we can look at studies like this, seeing that this sort of racist attitude still seeps through. Okay, so why do we need to deal with race? Why do what do we have to look at? We have to look at some of these effects from historical racism, the institutions, modern racist attitudes. This leads to the big question, which is what I'm going to leave off tonight, to set us up hopefully for the discussion the next 2 nights. And here's the big question. How do we correct for the historical and contemporary racial dysfunctions in our society in a way that's fair to everyone? How do we recover from our history of racial abuse in ways that most of us can consider those efforts to be fair? How do we do this? Now, if you're thinking, well, we have such a bad history of abuse, anything we do is fair, well, then why don't we just solve the problem by letting whites be slaves for 400 years? Doesn't seem fair, does it? There's got to be a way we can do this without doing something like that. How do we do that? How do we come to that? How do we struggle with that? That's what we're going to look at. Tomorrow, we're going to look at two different answers offered here, and I'm going to argue that neither one of them work. And then Thursday, what I hope to show is that I think there is a Christian path to a better answer. Okay, I'm ready for questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yancey. We're ready for questions. If you have questions, there's microphones at the top of the stairs. And if there's online questions, we'll hear from the online audience. Just keeping this slide up on the screen for a minute that we can see up here and they can see up
Sure.
there. The word fair, you didn't use the word just or justice. Maybe this is preempting future conversations, but could you say a little bit about the language of justice and the category of justice in the story that you've talked about and in your question?
Yeah, I didn't intentionally leave out justice. I wouldn't. We could put it, a way that is just to everyone, and I would be fine with that. But how we define justice is going to vary, and we need to figure that out and how we can work through that. And I'll get more into that on Thursday. So it wasn't an intention to slight justice.
Okay. Because that category is used a lot, and partly what I think many folks are trying to figure out is what are the right moral categories to bring to the conversation when there's the historical realities that you brought to our attention.
Yeah, I think the only reason why, and maybe subconsciously I did this, I use fair instead of justice, is that it comes with a certain amount of baggage. I think to enter into it, we have to limit the baggage as much as possible in order to engage in this sort of direction. So, so it may be subconsciously. It wasn't conscious. I'll just say that. But I'm just trying to think now. Yeah. Yep. Did I subconsciously do that? But yeah, I'd be comfortable saying that's just to everyone.
Okay. Good. Let's go to the question up here.
Just maybe your comment on this, as we think about the disparity between blacks and Hispanics and whites in the states. What was the significance of Barack Obama becoming president of the United States for black people?
Yeah, Barack Obama, that is interesting in that a lot of people talk about, well, Barack Obama will enter us into a post-racial society. And when you look at some of the writings of some of the academics, some of them were concerned that that people would try to be post-racial because of Obama. So there's that. Now, I do think that I remember about 20 years ago thinking that we'd get a woman president before we get a black president, and I was wrong. And so I do think that at least temporarily boosted the morale of many African Americans. I'll tell you that much. Some of the conflict that happened afterwards, and some of the ways that they felt he was treated, diminished that warm feeling. But that did boost the morale, because what it showed is that if you're black, you could become president of the United States. It maybe you're less likely to, but it's not an impossibility. And there's a big difference between the two. And so I think that was what he represented to the African American community to a large extent, as far as or him coming into it in that way. And yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question completely. I'm just sort of musing on Obama, but yeah.
Thank you. Yes, question up here. Thanks for coming to the mic.
Hi, Dr. Yancey, I'd just like to make a comment. I really enjoyed what you had to say. Being a child born in the 50s and from Montreal, and, you know, spending time in New York growing up too, I can identify with almost 99% of what you're saying, because I've been there. In the workforce, in school, child of an immigrant, growing up in an area that's predominantly Jewish and blacks, poor. In Montreal, same thing, New York City. Coming out here, working in government, discrimination, dealing with Jim Crow, people dressing up like Uncle Sam, blackface. So it was a bit triggering for me listening to what you're saying, because I've experienced all that. And I find myself as a person who was brought up to believe in Jesus and accept him as my Lord and Savior as a young child. Even in the Christian communities I grew up in, they weren't supportive at all. And I have experienced, from Montreal all the way here to the West Coast now, racism, even amongst Christians, things that they say, unaware, kind of like an unconscious bias, where, oh, I like you because you're not that dark, or you're more white than really black, aren't you? So it's been hard on me. And I spend a lot of time reading and studying history, just an interest. And I find that looking back on the history of blacks from Africa all the way through the Caribbean, into the USA and into Canada, I find myself kind of like feeling angry, particularly how Christianity was brought to the Africans, then brought to the Caribbean and onto the US. Just like the insensitivity, that looking down on us as inferior, not good enough. It's been hard on me, especially this last year. I've become very, very, very aware of insidiousness, even amongst the Christian community. I'm not talking about here, I'm talking about in general. You know, amongst Christians, amongst people who would normally not say anything overtly, like when I go to New York, I don't like you because you're black. But even here in Canada, I find there is racism, it's just more subtle. It's just subtle. Now the problem, for example, of the pro-Palestinian sympathizers and the Jews and the Christians, there's a lot of overt racism that's coming out everywhere. So it's been a tough battle. Coming back to me as a kid, being born in Canada of immigrant parents, growing up in low-income neighborhoods, even working in government and put in the crappy jobs because they didn't think I could do anything better. And it's been hard, especially now that I'm 67. All this stuff happened in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000. So I really have enjoyed what you've had to say. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. One of the categories that our guest just referred to was unconscious bias. Mm-hmm. Do you want to unpack that a little bit for us in terms of what it means and what some of the research around it has shown?
Yeah, so the research there is kind of sketchy a little bit. They used to talk about implicit bias, but really the research is showing that we don't know what those tests are measuring. I do think that there is biases that we tend to have that don't always play themselves out. One of the things, just looking at Christians, I did some research about 20 years ago, so I don't know if this is still true today, that looked at Christians and looking at dating. And what I found was that Christians were more open to dating someone of a different faith than a different race. And, so why that struck me is that growing up, I was always taught, don't date outside your faith. Don't date outside your faith, Do not be unequally yoked. No one ever taught me only date. No one ever, overtly taught me don't date outside your race. Now there are ways in which that message came across, and so to me that's an example of there are subtle ways messages get to you that you don't even recognize. There's the overt, don't be unequally yoked, and yet somehow all these Christians also picked up, don't date outside your race. And so, once again, that was just 20 years old, so I'm not sure that finding would be found today. But at least 20 years ago, that to me was an example of how this sort of subtle racism can seep in.
Very, very interesting. Let's go to the speaker up here.
Thanks for your illuminating talk and for sharing out of your personal story as well. I wonder if you could speak a bit, the institutions you mainly referenced there, health and legal and so on. I wonder if you could speak a bit about communities of faith and religious institutions. I think of W.E.B. Du Bois saying that no institution is more firmly built on the color line than the church in one of his criticisms. Could you speak a bit to what contemporary sociological studies are showing about faith communities?
Yeah, so there's interesting ways of looking at it. There was some research probably about 30 years ago that suggested that when people had intrinsic religiosity, they were actually less racist. When they had extrinsic religiosity, they were more racist. And by that, what they mean is, if this was something that a person really lived out their lives believing, they're less racist. But if church was just something to go so you can make a business deal and you're actually more racist. And I do think that we see some similarities of that today in that I think people who are more, I think what they're finding is that people who are adopting more white nationalism tend to be Christians who don't go to church. So I think there's something to that, but I'm not sure it's just as strong as it is today. There are ways in which clearly Christianity has both fought and encouraged racism. I went down to Southwestern Theological Seminary to look up pamphlets that were circulated in the 1800s, warning about that it was against God's will to date someone outside your race or to marry someone outside your race. I also know that the Gimke sisters and William Wilberforce were Christians who were keys to ending slavery. So it's not, there's no simple answer to the question on where Christians are at. I think it depends on the context and how we use our faith in order to challenge racism. I am concerned about, in America, about some Christians who have become more anti-immigrant of late, which is ironic because about 20 years ago, Christians were more pro-immigrant than average. So we have to be careful on how, and carefully think through our faith through some of these issues and not be persuaded by some of the, shall I say, ways of the day to head in directions that we shouldn't head into. But we can use our faith to do good. I want to make sure that, I don't want to just paint this picture that we've just been doing bad. There have been some Christians who've played very important roles in helping to address racial issues as well.
Can I just follow up on that, and then we'll come to your question over there. It's been said in the past that the most segregated hour in American society is Sunday at 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
Is that still true, or is that less true than it used to be?
It's less true. It's less segregated than it used to be, but I think it's still true. That's probably the most segregated hour. When we were doing the research around 2000, about 7.5% of all churches were multiracial. I think it's up to about 12% now. 12 last I looked at. So there's been some increase, and I think at fewer churches.
And what do you mean by multiracial?
Multiracial
church?
is a church where no one racial group is more than 80% of the church. Okay, so Now, this is the United States. In Canada, it may be totally different. I mean, but I'm sorry, a church where no one racial group is more than 80%, 80% of the church. So a white church with 75% white is a multiracial church, okay? Or a black church with 75%, or whatever. I do think that, so we know that we become more diverse, and there's fewer churches that are totally monoracial, like all black, all white, all Hispanic. There's fewer churches like that. So we are more diverse, but I still think that the workplace and schools are probably more diverse than the churches.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, let's go up here to your question. Sandra.
Hello, thank you so much, Dr. Yancey. I have a question about, so you talked about indirect discrimination still having negative impact, and then you talked about racism becoming more subtle. My question is, when it's indirect and it's subtle, it seems to be more difficult to prove that it's there.
Yeah.
Do you have any insights, or is there any research that can help to demonstrate that the impact is still as bad as direct discrimination and as overt racism?
Yeah, I don't know if I could say the research is as bad as something like Jim Crow or something like that. But what I would say is it's pretty bad. And there is research showing that regardless of whether or not there's intention, this has a very negative consequence on these groups. So, but I don't think that research, it's hard to compare two different time periods like that. I don't know if anyone's really has done that. Maybe someone has, and I just haven't read their work, but it still is very bad. So I'm comfortable saying it's very bad. I'm not gonna say it's as bad because when you think about some of the things that has been done, so yeah.
Yeah, question from our online audience.
Actually, no, this one is from me.
Oh, okay, you're allowed to do that
Not
too.
any online questions. I'm not filtering them out.
Yeah.
I was fascinated by a comment you made earlier about entering into this problem solving with as little baggage as possible. And I'm thinking of the Canadian context where we had a Truth and Reconciliation year, I think it was, of looking at the history of how settlers have treated the Indigenous community, and where truth-telling and kind of a retelling of what happened played an important role. And I was wondering if that is different, or how it is different from coming in with baggage. If you could elaborate
Sure.
on that. Thank you.
All right, baggage and truth-telling are not the same thing. Truth-telling is truth-telling. Baggage is when we bring stuff in. I'll put it this way. If you know that phrasing something a certain way makes someone less likely to hear you out, you're smarter to not phrase it that way, okay? So sometimes what some people do with truth-telling is, I can say whatever I want, however I want. And yeah, that's truth-telling, but that's not productive. And we'll go into that on Thursday. And so when I'm talking about baggage, I'm talking about trying to find ways in which people can hear. Because there's actually research that shows that if a person feels threatened by what you said, they literally cannot hear you. They just shut off. And they'll just smile at you, but they can't hear you. And so I have to figure out ways when I talk with people to have them to hear me. But that doesn't mean that I don't tell the truth, or even that I water things down. But I may phrase things in ways that are different.
Isn't there a risk of a kind of self-censorship, though, in that approach?
Yeah, but we all self-censor. I mean, who does not think about how they sound when they're speaking to their spouse or their kids or anything like that? I mean, when you care about someone, you think about how you're going to express yourself. It doesn't mean that you're not telling the truth, So, if self-censorship means I can't say, this point I want to make, then that's bad. Self-censorship means that I'm going to find a way to where my approach can be heard, then we all do that.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Yeah, is there a question up here? Yep, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Yancey, for addressing these issues head on, talking about the elephants in the room. But and maybe it's leading to the second and third lectures, but I'm trying to draw out of the United States, specifically and broader into our own context here in Canada, or in India, or in France. In other words, what can we learn from this looking forward? And maybe that's a concern, because, not a concern, that's an interest, because the United States is not one country. Coastal communities are different from interior communities. And so I'd be very interested in the next lectures about that, because there are different experiences. Your big question concerns me a little bit as a non-academic, because how do we correct and how do we recover, as distinct from how do we build? Because we are creatures of our history, our individual experiences, and so I like more positive questions, I guess.
We academics tend to be critical.
I'm sorry?
We academics tend to be critical.
And that's what you get paid for, right? And also, when we talk about as followers of Jesus Christ, there are sadly so many pockets, particularly in the land of the free now, that I'm most interested to know how you're going to unpack that in some of the contemporary things about the Christian experience in the United States. So, I mean, that's not a question. I'm just looking forward to the next two lectures.
Okay. I will say that if you're looking for me to give this magic thing that's going to solve all of these things, then I'm going to disappoint you. But I hope to give you some principles.
But you are looking to build, though. You're
Yeah,
not averse
right.
to the verb build.
Sure. Here's how I would look at it. All right, so, we've had centuries of racial abuse. So think about it as, this sort of bombed out building. Before you can build, you got to demo it. You got to demo it, and you got to set the foundation, and then you can build. And so, yeah, definitely, I want to build something. But I also see the need to do the demo first.
Yep. Okay, one last chance. Any further questions? We're almost at the top of the hour. Okay, then I'm going to say, join me in giving thanks to Dr. Yancey for his lecture. And we've been prompted toward the second lecture and the third, the second being tomorrow night, why the current solutions aren't enough, and we'll begin digging into the big question there. And then also, for those of you who would be on campus tomorrow, 12:30 in room 100, which is the room right across there, there's a question and answer session going to be moderated by Dr. Jessamine Birdsall, who's right there. So if you're on campus, feel free to join us at 12:30 for question and answer with Dr. Yancey. Thanks for being here, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow afternoon or tomorrow night. Have a good evening.